On the 1st of August 10 BC, in the town of Lugdunum, known today as Lyon in eastern France, an altar is publicly dedicated to Augustus. Just across town, a boy is born. He is named Tiberius Claudius Drusus. His father, Nero Drusus, was the son of Augustus's wife Livia, while his mother was the daughter of Mark Antony. This should have been a very fortunate head start in life for the young Claudius, as it was for his older brother Germanicus. However, fate would deal Claudius a very different hand to that of his siblings, which would quickly make his prospects of ever holding an important public role seem like mere fantasy. But if Claudius is remembered for one thing, it should be defying the odds through dramatic twists of fate. Very early into his youth, it became apparent that Claudius was not the typical picture of strength and vitality that his family would have desired. There are multiple varied accounts of his disabilities, and it's possible that some are fabricated or exaggerated. While it's difficult to say with certainty which symptoms he truly possessed and which were products of error or bias by the ancient records, some of those which are more commonly mentioned are his walking with a limp, having a stutter, as well as other speech difficulties and perceived brief outbursts of anger or laughter. Medical diagnosis of Claudius's condition is still a source of debate for modern historians. Until recently, the leading theory was cerebral palsy, but now many experts agree it was likely a form of Tourette's syndrome, which compounded with other physical ailments. Incompetent by his family and caused great embarrassment to most of them, who saw him as something of a stain on such a proud lineage. His mother was known to frequently deride him in conversations. His grandmother Livia refused to speak with him according to Suetonius, and he was generally ostracized wherever possible. His first tutor was a man of little renown, who Claudius later described as a barbarian, as he would often deliver frequent beatings and offered little help. At the age of 16, Claudius's toga virilis ceremony, a public coming-of-age tradition, was held at midnight in order for his family to avoid having to publicly display him as a worthy member of their line. The very next year, in 7 AD, perhaps the first significantly positive turn in Claudius's life took place, when Augustus, after having noticed an unexpected level of intelligence hidden behind his mannerisms, requested the famed writer Titus Livius, better known today as Livy, be hired as his tutor. He taught the young Claudius the oratory arts, who soon found himself far more adept at writing and delivering speeches than he was at casual conversation. Augustus remarks at the results in a letter to Livia. My dear Livia, your grandson Tiberius Claudius has given me a very pleasant surprise. How on earth anyone who talks so confusedly can nevertheless speak in public with such clearness, saying all that needs to be said, I simply do not understand. However, this would prove to be little more than a curiosity in the eyes of the patrician family, as they would quash any attempts he made toward securing a public role. According to Suetonius, the only position Augustus gave to Claudius was one at the College of Augurs, which it seemed he may have never utilized. Continuing his streak of bad luck, he was finally married around 9 AD after 2 unsuccessful betrothals, the first being cancelled for political reasons, the second due to the death of his betrothed shortly before the wedding. When Augustus died in 19 AD, Claudius was given an inheritance of around 1,000 aurae, Roman gold pieces, which was a very meager sum considering his close familial ties to the emperor. With Tiberius as the new emperor, Claudius once again tried his luck at being allowed a public career, and the new emperor instead gave him a position in the priesthood of Augustus, which came with very little power or prestige. Not long after, he asked again for a higher role, and Suetonius recalls an anecdote of Tiberius sending Claudius the consular regalia, a sum of 40 aurae, though withholding the actual role of consul, stating he expected the money would be, quote, squandered on toys in the Saturnalia and Sigillaria. While this is likely a very exaggerated, if not entirely false story, it illustrates how ridiculous the idea of giving Claudius such a position was to Tiberius, and likely many others at the time. Outside of his attempts at a public life, Claudius spent his time on academic pursuits, writing histories of Rome, Carthage, and Etruria. He also gained something of a reputation for drinking and gambling, seen as lower class behaviours, unfitting of his station. However, this may have partially helped the positive opinion the public seemed to hold of him. Claudius also had 2 children with his first wife, Claudia Urgulanilla, whom he divorced shortly after, suspecting their daughter was a product of adultery. This left his first son, Claudius Drusus, as his only child. The boy was soon arranged to marry Aelia Junilla, the daughter of the controversial figure Sejanus, who was head of the Praetorian Guard at the time. It seems that this was an unpopular decision, perhaps due to the relatively low status of Sejanus, as it risked polluting the patrician family line. The marriage, however, would not come to pass, as Claudius Drusus would die before reaching adulthood. Accounts disagree on the year and cause of his death. Some suggested he was murdered by order of Sejanus, but ultimately we do not know. Suetonius, as he often does, opted for a more entertaining story, suggesting instead that he died of asphyxiation after throwing a pear and attempting to catch it in his mouth. While this story is certainly questionable, the fact remains that the untimely death of his son meant Claudius was now alone and in need of a new wife. He married Aelia Paetina in 28, whom he had a daughter with, and then divorced just 3 years later. It was in this same year that the supposed conspiracy by the now consul Sejanus was exposed. Tiberius had him swiftly executed, and as he was a born member of their rank, the equestrians sent a delegation to offer felicitations. They chose Claudius to lead it, marking the second time they had elected him for a similar role, a clear indication of his higher standing with the less noble classes. This slowly growing public opinion would eventually prove a great boon to Claudius's career, perhaps sooner than you might think. Toward the end of his reign, an increasingly disinterested Tiberius had adopted his grandnephew Gaius, better known today as Caligula, and named him heir alongside his grandson Gemellus. Following Tiberius's death in 37, Gemellus was barely old enough to rule, making Caligula the more suitable candidate, who then set out securing his position by voiding the part of Tiberius's will which named Gemellus as a claimant. As the new sole emperor of Rome, Caligula's reign began relatively smoothly, though this would not last forever. As he began to gain a reputation for being hot-headed, cruel, and unreasonable, he likely would have noticed the relatively good opinion the people held of his uncle, none other than Claudius. This may be why he chose to make Claudius his co-consul, perhaps seeing a need to prevent such a disgraceful member of the family from rising above his station, or perhaps out of personal vanity. Either way, Caligula took the opportunity to frequently and publicly berate his uncle, likely hoping to make as big a fool out of him as possible. This, however, may have had the opposite effect, as following the conspiracy to assassinate Caligula, the Praetorian Guard elected Claudius as emperor. Just 2 days later, the chaos in the Senate had died down, and Claudius was officially declared the new emperor. The reason for such a rapid and unexpected shift in power is likely that the Senate and Praetorian Guard saw Claudius as weak-willed and easily controllable, especially given the rumors that some senators had been pushing for dismantling of the monarchy. Such a move would greatly upset the public, however, so it may have been a better idea to use Claudius to slowly dissolve the monarchy from within. It would seem this was the case, as according to Cassius Dio, some of Claudius's first acts were aimed at restoring the elements of the Republic, and pardoning many of the senatorial conspirators against his nephew. It would not be smooth sailing for long, however, as just a year into his reign, Claudius faced the first of many plots against him. The senator Aeneas Vinicianus, with the help of the governor of Dalmatia, a man by the name of Scribonianus, began to mobilize an army to overthrow the new emperor. According to Suetonius, soldiers enlisted for the plot all deserted before the fighting could begin, swiftly ending the coup. Claudius, not wanting to show weakness, had the conspirators executed. He then sent gifts to the men's sons, perhaps to prevent any future acts of revenge. But Claudius still sought ways to prove his strength and capability, and so, around a year later, he would begin the most monumental undertaking of his reign, the likes of which had not been seen since the time of Julius Caesar. It had been almost a century since Roman legions had marched on British soil under Caesar, and since then it had remained almost entirely free of Roman influence, with only a few tribes paying small tithes to Rome. As civil strife within Britain began to threaten some of these tribes, they called to Rome for aid. Claudius, seeing the opportunity for not only the resources in Britain, but the glory of finishing the work of Caesar, responded by sending 4 legions under the general Aulus Plautius. This was far more than necessary to help the tribal allies, as Claudius intended a total conquest of Britain. Of the 4 legions, consisting of 40,000 legionaries, 3 were brought from Gaul, one of which was led by the future Emperor Vespasian. They marched through Gaul toward the coast of the British Channel. Upon reaching it, however, Cassius Dio recounts the difficulty Plautius had in convincing his men to sail across. Supposedly, they refused to board the ships until the freedman Narcissus, sent by Claudius, had attempted to address them. This roused the troops, who, offended at being addressed by a former slave, chose instead to make a point of following the orders of Plautius. After landing, most likely in Kent, the Romans pushed northwest, eventually fighting their way across the Thames, at which point they awaited the arrival of Claudius. The emperor was not in Britain for long before receiving the surrender of multiple British kings, and returned to Rome victorious. According to the inscription on the Arch of Claudius in Rome, he received the surrender of 11 kings of the Britons, defeated without any loss, and first brought the barbarian peoples across the ocean into the dominion of the Roman people. While it is possible this could be an exaggeration, it is unlikely that he took no losses. It cannot be understated what an achievement this was for Claudius. He had expanded the empire north further than even Caesar, and was the first emperor since that time to be present for such a conquest. Upon his arrival back in Rome, he was given many honors, including being designated imperator for the 5th time, having 2 arches dedicated to the triumph, the previously mentioned arch in Rome, as well as one on the coast of Gaul, and he was given the title of Britannicus, which he instead chose to give to his son. Now settled back in Rome, Claudius went back to business as usual, continuing to make reforms and thwart conspiracies against him in equal measure. Claudius's relationship with the senators was seemingly in constant flux, and perhaps it was his aim to increase their opinion of him when he made efforts toward restoring it back to the days of the Republic. However, it would seem this did little to help, as another conspiracy was uncovered in 46 AD, led by 2 men named Asinius Gallus and Statilius Corvinus, though the details are unknown. However, not every plot was against the emperor, as according to Cassius Dio, in the same year 2 prominent senators were poisoned by Claudius's wife Messalina. Claudius had married Messalina in 38 AD, and she was his 3rd wife, and one of the 2 responsible for his reputation throughout history as a puppet to his wives. By most accounts, Messalina was cruel, scheming, and adulterous. And while there are many examples of this behavior, there are just as many unsubstantiated rumors. Her story has become one of the most dramatic tales of Julio-Claudian history, and it would be naive to suppose the ancient writers would let the truth get in the way of such a good story. There are further accounts of her frequent adultery, as well as attempting to have the young Nero assassinated after his appearance at the recent games had drawn more approval from the crowd than that of her own son, Britannicus. To what extent Claudius was aware of this is not certain, so it cannot be said for sure that he was simply complacent. Messalina's adultery came to a head when, while Claudius was away in 48 AD, she held a public wedding with a senator named Gaius Silius. Claudius was notified of this by his freedman Narcissus, claiming it was an attempt to overthrow him. According to Tacitus, Claudius returned to Rome, but did not have Messalina executed. Instead, the order was given by Narcissus, pretending to act on behalf of the emperor. This version of events is suspicious, however, as historian Garrett Fagan points out. It is certainly a better fit for the narrative of Claudius as unwilling to defy his wives, but it is more likely that he was the one to give the order for Messalina to be killed, as forgiving such an enormous offense would be seen as an unprecedented public display of weakness. Claudius's next marriage, in 49 AD, to his niece, Agrippina the Younger, was most likely one of political purpose. His marital history had become a source of controversy, and he again needed to boost his legitimacy as emperor, due to the increasing hostility of the Senate, partly spurred on by his allowance of freedmen into official positions, which was seen by some as a mockery of their status. However, marriage to one's niece was still seen as incestuous in Rome, and Claudius had to petition the Senate with the help of future Emperor Vitellius in order to have it legitimized. Unfortunately, this union would prove to be Claudius's final mistake. Agrippina was an ambitious woman, and according to the ancient writers, just as cruel as Messalina. She quickly focused her efforts towards ensuring her son Nero would succeed Claudius, sidelining Britannicus as much as possible. The ancient sources agree that after a few years, when Nero was ready to take the throne, Agrippina had Claudius poisoned. It is not known whether he died that day or shortly after, but regardless, Claudius's life and reign came to an end in 54 AD. He died at the age of 63 and was afterwards deified, but this would be the extent of his legacy. He was succeeded by his adopted stepson Nero, as planned, and this would eventually spell the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the first emperors of Rome. Through all of this, it's important to remember that we're speaking of the lives and opinions of an important yet ultimately small group. As is the nature of history, we seldom hear from the quiet masses. There is no evidence of public disquiet or revolt under Claudius, making him quite unlike many of his successors. As such, I find it interesting to imagine how the Roman populace must have felt at the time. Those who lived through the reign of Claudius, looking back on it in the chaos that ensued after. Would they have felt the same way as Tacitus and Suetonius, whose perception of those times were built on decades-old second-hand memories? Would he have stuck out to them as a brief but welcome respite from the downward trajectory of the Julio-Claudians? Did the countless people who lived their lives under the rule of Claudius see him as a weak-willed fool or the last great emperor of his dynasty?